You're at a party, or a work event, or running into someone at the grocery store who clearly knows you, whose face you recognize completely, whose entire personality and context and history you can access, and yet their name is just gone. Nowhere. You search the mental filing cabinet and find it conspicuously, embarrassingly empty. So you do what everyone does in this situation. You smile warmly, you say, "Hey, so good to see you." You maneuver through the entire conversation with the linguistic agility of a diplomat, never once using their name, hoping against hope that someone nearby will say it for you. And if you're lucky, someone does. And if you're not lucky, you leave the conversation sweating slightly, wondering what is wrong with you. Because that's the thing, isn't it? Forgetting names feels personal. It feels like evidence of something. Carelessness, self-absorption, a memory that's starting to go. When you forget someone's name, the interpretation you're most likely to reach for is moral rather than neurological. You feel rude. You feel like you weren't paying enough attention, like you didn't care enough to remember. And the person whose name you forgot, if they ever found out, might feel the same way. But here's what's actually happening in your brain when a name slips away. It has almost nothing to do with how much you care, and everything to do with a very specific quirk in the way human memory is built. And once you understand it, you will never feel quite the same kind of shame about it again. Let's start with something memory researchers have known for decades, but that almost never makes it into casual conversation. Not all information is created equal in the brain's storage system. Your memory doesn't file things by importance or by how much you consciously want to retain them. It files them by meaning, by emotion, by association, and by context. The richer the web of connections surrounding a piece of information, the more retrieval pathways exist for it, and the easier it is to pull back up later. The thinner that web, the more isolated the information, the more vulnerable it is to disappearing. Now consider what a name is. A name is, in the most purely cognitive sense, an arbitrary label. There is nothing about the word Michael that inherently connects to the face, the voice, the personality, the profession of any particular Michael. The name and the person are linked by convention, not by logic. Compare that to how you store other information about someone. Their job, that connects to a whole network of associations, experiences, feelings about that kind of work. Their laugh, that has an emotional quality, a sensory texture. Something they said that was funny or surprising, that has narrative weight, context, meaning. All of that information arrives with built-in hooks. The name arrives almost alone. No hooks. Just a word floating in space. This is why you can remember everything about a person, their face, their energy, their life story, the fact that they have a dog named something, and still be completely unable to produce their name. The name isn't stored the same way. It lives in a different part of the retrieval architecture, more fragile, more isolated, more dependent on specific conditions to surface. You didn't fail to care enough. You just encountered one of the most persistent quirks in human memory design. There's a specific phenomenon psychologists call the next-in-line effect, identified by researcher Brenner in the 1970s, which gives you a window into exactly why introductions are such a memory disaster. When you're about to be introduced to someone, your brain is simultaneously managing your own social performance, what you're going to say, how you're presenting, whether your handshake is appropriate, and trying to receive incoming information at the same time. The cognitive load of those two things happening simultaneously means that the incoming name, which lands right at the moment of peak self-focus, barely gets encoded at all. You were too busy being introduced to actually register the introduction. The name was never properly filed, and you can't retrieve what was never fully stored. This is why the common advice, repeat their name right after you hear it, actually works, and why most people don't do it. Repeating the name immediately forces a second encoding pass. It gives the brain a second moment to lay down a slightly deeper trace. It starts building the first thread of an associative network. But the moment of introduction is often exactly the moment people are most self-conscious, most focused on their own impression management, least available to do that cognitive work. So the name slides by and is gone before it ever quite arrived. And then there's attention. Not attention in the moral sense, not whether you're a good enough person to pay attention, but attention in the neuroscientific sense. Focused, deliberate attention is a finite resource. Your brain can only fully process so much incoming information at once, and it makes constant, automatic decisions about what gets the full processing treatment and what gets the abbreviated version. In novel social situations, the brain is doing an enormous amount of work, reading faces, assessing tone, navigating social hierarchy, managing anxiety, tracking the conversation, and names, which arrive as a brief auditory event with no inherent emotional significance, often simply don't clear the threshold for deep processing. Not because you're distracted in the dismissive sense, because your brain is genuinely busy with competing demands. People with social anxiety, interestingly, forget names at particularly high rates, and the reason illuminates the mechanism beautifully. When anxiety is elevated in a social situation, the brain's threat monitoring systems consume a significant portion of available cognitive bandwidth. You're using so much mental energy managing the emotional experience of the interaction that there's simply less left over for encoding information like names. This is why the people who seem most socially nervous are often the ones most likely to forget who they just met, and why they then feel most guilty about it, adding injury to injury. There is also a fascinating cultural and individual variation in name memory that doesn't get enough attention. Research has found that people are significantly better at remembering names from their own cultural background than names from unfamiliar ones. This is not prejudice, it's pattern recognition. The brain encodes new information by connecting it to existing knowledge structures. A name that fits familiar phonetic patterns, that rhymes with other names you know, that has a recognizable structure, gets hooked into existing memory scaffolding. A name that's unfamiliar in its sound and structure arrives without that scaffolding and has to be stored more effortfully, more deliberately, or it doesn't stick. In increasingly diverse social environments, this becomes a more common experience for everyone, and it's worth knowing that struggling with unfamiliar names isn't a character statement. It's a reflection of cognitive architecture encountering the genuinely new. There are also real individual differences in what's called face-name associative memory, the specific ability to link a face to a label. Some people are simply better at this than others, and brain imaging research has shown that this corresponds to measurable differences in how the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex communicate during encoding. This is not a deficiency, it's a variation. The same way some people have perfect pitch and others don't, some people have robust face-name binding, and others have to work harder at it. Neither is a moral status. So what do you do with all of this? A few things, and none of them require you to become a different kind of person. The most effective strategy isn't trying to pay more attention, because attention is already doing its best. It's creating more association at the moment of introduction. When you hear someone's name, connect it to something immediately, anything. A person you already know with that name, a word it sounds like, something about their appearance or the context you're meeting them in, even a brief, silent mental image. What you're doing is building the first strands of an associative web around that isolated label, giving it hooks so it has somewhere to live in the filing system. It takes about 2 seconds. It makes a measurable difference. And when you do forget, which you will, because you're human and names are genuinely difficult, the most useful thing is to simply ask, "I'm so sorry, I've forgotten your name," is a far less damaging social event than the elaborate name avoidance dance most people perform for entire conversations. People are almost always gracious about it, because most of them, privately, have been on exactly the same side of that situation more times than they'd like to admit. You are not someone who doesn't care. You are someone with a memory system that prioritizes meaning, emotion, and context. And names, by their nature, arrive as none of those things. The inconvenience is real. The shame is optional. If you've spent years quietly embarrassed by this, I hope something here gave you a little room to breathe. Drop your most awkward name-forgetting story in the comments. I have a feeling we could fill a very long thread. And if you want to keep exploring the surprisingly logical reasons behind the things your brain does that seem inexplicable, stick around.